Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Brain Curiosities podcast, the first one in 2024. We are here today with Sofia Pinto, that is a researcher on ADHD and nutrition. So, hi, Sofia. And can you
Hi.
tell us more about yourself, about your lab, and about your research?
Well, hello, and thank you for inviting me, Ludovico. It's with a great pleasure that I'm here talking to you. As you said, I am a Portuguese nutritionist with a master's in pediatric nutrition. So I mainly work with children. And since my master's, I've been focusing on the associations about nutrition and ADHD. And currently, I've enrolled in a PhD where I'm still studying this association and trying to explore where can nutrition help people with ADHD, and how can we better treat these people and these symptoms. And my main area of interest is the gut-brain axis in the context of ADHD. And my team and we have an ongoing project called the M2Child project, which is in Porto University at the Faculty of Medicine. And we are recruiting children, many children with ADHD. But we have a multidisciplinary team that is wonderful and that is studying all these different aspects of ADHD, not just nutrition. This is my interest, and that's why I think you invited me.
Yeah, it's because you wrote a review. It was a very interesting review on the food intervention, specifically on people with ADHD, correlated mostly with ADHD symptoms and their severity.
Yeah.
So
in 2022.
Yeah. But it was really interesting to read. And so one of my first questions for you, and that I had completely forgotten to give you in advance, but it's basically, how does nutrition impact people in general, and why do you think it can impact specifically people with ADHD, maybe more or less than others?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because we have a bidirectional association between nutrition and the ADHD. And now we are going to start with the impact of nutrition in ADHD. And what we do know is that there are specific nutrients that can affect cognitive function and the brain function and the neurodevelopmental stage in children. But there's no specific nutrients that can really impact, or I'm going to use the word cause ADHD. And that's really important to note that nutrition cannot cause ADHD. This is a multifactorial condition, and there's not one factor causing ADHD. There's so many factors, and I think it's important that people do not believe that nutrition or just one supplement can cure ADHD. We have a whole dietary pattern that should be healthy, and we should promote a healthy eating pattern and a better health in general. But nutrition cannot really cure ADHD, and we cannot specifically associate one nutrient with ADHD.
Yeah. So in your review, you mentioned that ADHD symptoms decreased when there was an intervention specifically with magnesium and vitamin D, but only in cases where people had deficits in those nutrients and not when they didn't. So can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Those specific studies have shown that where there was a baseline deficit in those specific nutrients, mainly magnesium and vitamin D, there was an improvement in ADHD symptoms. However, I think it's important to have a critical view about these studies, because if there was a deficit at the baseline, the improvements seen with the supplementation cannot be attributed to that supplement, but to mitigate that deficit that there was at the beginning. And so what I do recommend is that people get tests and to see if they have deficits, and then to use supplements, but not to supplement if we don't know the baseline levels.
Yeah, and this so a lot of people with ADHD notice that with more magnesium and more vitamin D, generally their symptoms, they improve, or also they manage to better manage their symptoms. But this is also because there is definitely a correlation between ADHD and vitamin D and magnesium deficits as well, right? If I'm not...
There's not mechanistic studies showing an interaction between vitamin D and ADHD, but the prevalence of deficits of those two nutrients is so great that most people do have those deficits, not just ADHD people. Okay, so there's not studies showing as what vitamin D can specifically do in ADHD and also in magnesium, but we do see an improvement in better ADHD management.
Yeah, because if most people have these deficits, and vitamin D being a precursor of serotonin decreases, depressive symptoms and so on, then ADHD of course becomes more manageable. And if many people have these kind of deficits, then of course when people take these supplements, it's going to get better, because as a baseline, then everyone. Yeah, that's very interesting, because there was a lot of people that reported that with magnesium and vitamin D supplements, their symptoms got better, but that now makes a lot of sense.
I just wanted to say that in nutrition and with supplements, there's a lot of placebo effect, and people note a difference and note an improvement, but there's no clinical trials that really say that supplement with these nutrients and you improve, and that improvement is objective, and not when people notice a difference is a bit subjective and may have that placebo effect.
So are there some studies that have tested this in ADHD, or even in in non-ADHD people? For example, supplementations of L-tyrosine, tryptophan, magnesium, vitamin D, and whatever against placebo, so in controlled trials?
Yeah, we do have some studies, randomized controlled trials, with vitamin D. But what those trials do is mega doses with vitamin D. And so not a recommended dose of vitamin D and also magnesium, but mainly in vitamin D. When you read those papers, the doses that they supplement are above the recommended levels, and so that poses a bit of a limitation, not a limitation, but a concern, because we don't know the toxicity levels of mega doses of vitamin D long term.
Yeah.
So I don't think that mega doses of these nutrients can or should be done or should be recommended long term and on a clinical practice. What I do believe is that we should measure those nutrients in the blood, for example, and then supplement if there's a deficit, and supplement with lower doses and across time, not just because also those clinical trials are really short term. They do need the results in short term. They do not assess long term these effects on ADHD, and so
it's not longitudinal studies.
Yeah, it's not. It's just I don't know for sure the weeks that they've tested, but it's 10, 15 weeks of supplementing, and so I do not recommend using those mega doses without knowing your baseline levels.
Yeah, definitely. Then there's other supplements that are going around right now. For example, lion's mane, that has been shown to increase the BDNF factor of neural growth. L-tyrosine, that is a precursor of dopamine. So it's thought that if you have more L-tyrosine, you have more dopamine, and that makes it easier for ADHD. What are your thoughts about those?
Yeah. But what I do know is that there's a deficit in these specific neurotransmitters like tryptophan, and that it's not neurotransmitters. They are
amino acids.
Yeah, they are precursors of neurotransmitters, and so supplementing them or using foods that are richer in those amino acids can be helpful. For example, foods that are rich in tryptophan can be seem to be helpful in ADHD, but it's also the same line of thought that I've talked about nutrients. If there's a baseline deficiency in these amino acids, and that was shown in ADHD, maybe I will start by saying that we should start by foods and then supplements, and not the other way around. Maybe we should improve our diet and maybe seek these foods that are rich in amino acids. For example, one interesting food are eggs that are rich in also choline, that has its amino acid that has been studied in the context of ADHD and appears to be decreased in ADHD. And so start with these foods, start with improving your diet in general, and then maybe what the main problem is that when we consume these foods that are rich in those amino acids, we cannot be sure that they are being converted in neurotransmitters. And so when I talk about increasing these foods, is within a whole diet, and not just saying that increasing the intake of choline or tryptophan or tyrosine will increase the neurotransmitters level. And I'm not aware that there are different levels of requirements for ADHD and non-ADHD people, and so maybe that should be studied, but I'm not aware of these studies showing that there should be different baseline levels.
What do you think? I mean, do you think that there might be a difference because of the intake of these nutrients, the rate of absorption, of course, but also the rate of modification, the rate of expulsion, and so on, might differ in people with ADHD that have been known to have metabolic issues as well? So can that be different because maybe you have more in your bloodstream, but it's not what is being modified into the right neurotransmitters, or it's not being used as it's supposed to?
Yeah. My main concern is that increasing protein or amino acid rich foods can also have other metabolic impacts. And so I do think that we should be careful with these associations, because we can increase our intake, but we are not sure if they are really turning into neurotransmitters. And we cannot, in a clinical setting, we cannot measure neurotransmitters, and we cannot be sure if they are turning amino acids in those neurotransmitters.
Yeah, that's the very complicated part.
Yeah, maybe in a more research environment we can explore that. I do not know if there's any studies studying this increase in amino acids in intake and neurotransmitters levels. I do not know if there are any studies about this, but it can be interesting.
Yeah, we should probably look into it at some point. All right, then I wanted to ask another question, which is, there is a lot of talk about, even a lot of doctors that say that ADHD, is caused by bad nutrition. that you just have to rebalance your gut-brain axis and your ADHD will magically go away. So I think that I already know the answer to that, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. What do you think about that?
Well, of course, I'm a nutritionist, and I do believe that a good diet and a good nutrition can have an impact in general health and in particular in ADHD. And so I do believe that in a clinical setting, we should give nutritional advice and also physical activity advice, which is not my area, but I do believe that these two should be integrated in the treatment, in the management of ADHD. But of course, as I've said before, we cannot state that nutrition can cause ADHD and the other way around, nutrition cannot cure ADHD. So we do have to always prioritize pharmacological treatment, psychological treatment, and nutrition can be a coadjuvant of these treatments. And actually, I've read the National Institute for Health and Care guidelines, specifically in ADHD, and they do emphasize that nutrition and a better diet in general should be advised in ADHD, in the context of ADHD. And the stepwise approach should be maybe in a younger age, we should start with those the severity or the symptoms are not improving or being stabilized over time. Of course, I'm not saying just to use nutritional interventions at all. You should always seek other professionals, and I think that professionals should work as a team.
Yeah.
And I think that's the wonderful thing about our project. So I'm really proud that I'm in a team of other professionals that are psychologists, that are psychiatrists, and we do think that nutrition has a part of it, but not believe that nutrition can cure or cause ADHD at all.
So up to one point, would you say nutrition can impact ADHD or life with ADHD? Because having ADHD symptoms and managing ADHD symptoms is two very different things. So to what extent do you think that nutrition can create issues for people with ADHD or can solve those issues, on the other hand?
Well, what the studies have shown us is that a healthy eating pattern, for example, the Mediterranean diet, which has a protective effect on ADHD. This doesn't necessarily mean that this diet can protect against ADHD. This only means that there's an association and that we should promote those healthy eating patterns. On the other way, a Western-like pattern that is rich in processed foods, in sugar, in all those red meats, it has a contrary effect on ADHD. It's associated with an increased odds of ADHD.
All
and
right.
So we have that balance that, of course, the people with ADHD will have some particular aspects. We've read a lot about eating disorders in ADHD, and so we also know that ADHD people might have some difficulties with attention demands that are required to sit through a meal and to eat a proper meal and to plan those meals, and so the nutritional intake might be compromised. But I think we should see the relationship between nutrition and ADHD as a whole eating pattern that can be protective or associated with an increased risk of ADHD. And so a more holistic view and not just nutrients that can specifically cause ADHD.
All right. So I have several questions stemming out of that. of course. The first one is you've talked about processed food and sugars. So, what is the impact that has been observed with sugar intake and processed foods in people with ADHD? What are the exact consequences that one can have after eating such foods?
Yeah, an interesting study about that is a case control study where the authors showed that a pattern rich in processed and sweet foods, it's associated with an increased odds of I have those data here, 1.5 the odds of having ADHD. What we do know is that processed foods can increase an inflammatory response, and that inflammation can be associated with ADHD and with the whole health in general.
Mm-hmm.
But that inflammation can also be associated with symptom severity and with an improvement, or the other way, with an increase in symptoms. And so processed foods, and also when we see in that whole pattern, when we see specific increase in red meats, in processed red meats, in sugars, in fats, we can see that maybe the association with ADHD is through inflammation.
Okay, so reversing this pattern and this eating habits, for example, would also be a good intervention for people that, for example, I'm going to be talking about countries now, but for example, in the US, the quality of food is not the same as in the Mediterranean, and also the accessibility to non-processed food is not the same. So a lot of people generally are eating a lot of processed food with a lot of sugar, with a lot of added sugar, even within the bread. That is something that does not exist in Europe. But so for a lot of people in the US that do have ADHD and that do have this type of nutrition, reversing the nutrition back to maybe a more natural or Mediterranean diet could help them with their ADHD symptoms over time.
Yeah, sure. There's an interesting study about that Mediterranean diet associated with a protective effect in ADHD. And so when we advise people with ADHD, we can start with those eating habits and to improve those eating habits, to promote a Mediterranean diet. And we know that a Mediterranean diet is rich in polyphenols, it's rich in good fats, omega-3s, that are also related to that inflammation that I've talked previously. And so I think that it's a good way to help with ADHD.
So if someone has already a Mediterranean diet and has ADHD, there's basically no intervention that is possible at this point.
Yeah, no, we can, within a Mediterranean diet, we can also improve.
All right.
For example, increasing the intake of fermented foods, to increase so many different aspects. I think in each individual, we have to personalize that intervention and to see specific parts of the whole diet. A big
it's very general.
It's very general, exactly. But then we can specifically target some nutrients, some parts of the diet. For example, the fermented foods that can help with the gut microbiota.
Yeah.
And so we have to assess individually.
Okay. And so the second part of this question is that, we talked about sugars and processed foods, and I've heard a lot, especially on social media, people talking about sugar and how the sugar high and the sugar crash can impact ADHD. So what is the
So what we do know is that ADHD is associated with some attentional deficits and some emotional dysregulation that can impact diet and can impact nutrition. And so when we have to sit through a meal and to eat a proper meal sitting down and to enjoy it, maybe ADHD people will have some troubles there. And as you've said, to plan them to to buy foods and to plan those meals can be an issue and can be a specific issue in ADHD.
Oh yeah, very much so.
Yeah, you do relate.
Yeah.
Yeah. And further, we do know that there's a high comorbidity of ADHD and eating disorders, mainly in those addictive-like eating disorders. We know that there's a high comorbidity of ADHD and anorexia, of binge eating. And in children, it has been described a syndrome of loss of control, overeating syndrome. And that's very interesting. And when we think about those, what can be the mechanism, we know that ADHD is associated with emotional dysregulation, with a negative affectivity, and so those two mediators can be impacting the eating pattern and can be associated with eating disorders.
Yeah, and there's also, if I'm not mistaken, because people with ADHD have deficits also, not only the dopamine system, but also in the norepinephrine one, and the norepinephrine one also controls the release of leptin, that controls satiety and these kind of feelings. It's also very hard for a lot of people with ADHD to feel hunger or to feel full. And so you only rely on how much pleasure you have out of it until you are so full that you cannot eat anymore.
Yeah.
And so there's also difficulty with alexithymia and proprioception.
Yeah. And I would like to add that some of the medications used can have an appetite suppressant effect.
Yes.
And that can also impact. And so we see a lot of differences in the appetites of during the day. When the medication is completely on, the appetite usually is decreased. And so, but we can use that variation of appetite during the day. So I think that using those variations, we can, for example, okay, if you don't have the appetite, you can eat less during the first part of the day, and then when you have that appetite and that's when you have that appetite, you can plan a better meal to have to sit and to enjoy that meal. So of course there's a variation of appetite, but we can adapt nutrition to those variations.
Okay, so this was one of the questions that people on Instagram asked about specifically, and they said, how can you control for the crash, let's say in the evening? So how can you manage your intake of food when you have an appetite suppressant medication during the day and then during the night suddenly you binge? So how to avoid that binge eating in the night?
Okay. Well, to avoid I think at first I would like to say that those binge-like effects on diet, it's very common. But what we can do is to have small meals throughout the day, and not just sugar or carbohydrates rich meals, but we can use meals with protein that are balanced meals with protein, carbohydrates, and also fats throughout the day, and not just to plan those. It can be really small meals, but those small meals are really important to avoid those spikes at night.
At the end of the night, all right, yeah, because protein, maybe it's more takes more time to be digested, and so it's you feel fuller. I mean, honestly, I have experienced the the binging at night after the medication wears off, and it's really, you feel as if you're the most hungry person ever in the world, because it's so difficult. And even if you have eaten well during the day, you still have this huge cravings at night. It's really chemical. It's, as if when you smoke weed, it's that kind of sensation of deep hunger. And so I get that it might be very, very difficult to, control for that, even with protein. I did notice that with protein, it was a bit less.
Yeah.
So that's definitely very good advice that you gave there, but it's, it's still very much present. It's still very difficult at times.
Yeah.
And so the second question that I have regarding this is that, before you said that most interventions should be done via food rather than via supplements. However, when you're working with a population that has a hard time planning meals, that has a hard time even just remembering to eat, or has a hard time with eating disorders in which, controlling for food might aggravate those eating disorders, how can you control nutrition in those cases? And isn't, in those cases, supplements, outside supplements, a better way to go to have a balance of macro and micronutrients?
Okay. I do not think that supplements are a better way of nutrition, and they do have a space where people, when we see that those deficits in specific nutrients are really impacting the people functioning and ADHD symptoms. However, we have to try to figure out what can we do based on foods. And when we have an eating disorder, I do think that nutrition should work together with psychology, and first do try to figure out that those issues, and then to use supplements when we see that it's really impacting people's functioning. And so I do work with children, and supplements are really not our first approach.
Well, with children it's different because you can have parents that contribute to this, but I think when you're an adult,
in adults,
it's a lot harder because you're the one responsible for your own food, and so suddenly, this is something that happened to me a lot of times. You go to the doctor and they say you should have more intake of this and that food, and it's just not going to happen because I'm going to forget, I'm not going to be able to plan, and it's just going to be one of those things where I say, oh, I should do it, and then I feel guilty about it and then never do it anyway. So it was more in those cases where I said, wouldn't supplementation for adults that are in those cases might be just more useful right away, instead of going through the guilt phase and not being able to do it anyway.
Okay.
Even if a nutritionist told me you have to buy this, and that, then I am the one who has to go to the supermarket. I have to the one to has to do the cooking, and some days I manage, but most days I don't. And this is also why I don't really connect with the idea that there is, an easy option and a better option, because it's more like there is a possible option and a very improbable one.
Okay.
So this is, more how I view it. So I agree that, of course, interventions should be nutrition based and so on. This is the optimal case. But in practical cases where, you have to deal with life and with work and just with everyday occurrences of stuff, then how can you manage to adapt your nutrition in a healthy way, but also in a way that doesn't require so much energy that you just sacrifice everything else?
Yeah, of course. And nutrition should be enjoyable and should not be another burden into your life. But when we okay, so I'm not saying anything.
No, go on.
No. Just I don't know how to explain that.
I mean, these are hard questions. I mean, there's a very big difference between the lived experience of the patient and what you study and you see in papers. And this is also why I'm doing these conversations, because there's really an enormous difference sometimes between the two things, because what you observe from an outside perspective and what you live from the inside perspective are just two entirely different things. And so sometimes some interventions that would be optimal in theory on paper are just not going to happen in practice because life happens. And so this was kind of my question, like considering that now we have, the two sides, how do we manage to make them work together?
Yeah, I do agree with you. And as you know, my experience is with children, and I do not work with adults with ADHD.
Of course.
And maybe that's different.
Yeah, and because then the parents can handle that.
Exactly. But let's just say, to assess individually, I do not want to say that supplements can be used for all people with ADHD.
Yeah, because sometimes they just also won't work.
Yeah. We have a lot of issues with supplements, the bioavailability. With food supplements, we do not have the control as with other drugs, and so I'm a bit concerned with saying that supplements can be. Obviously, they are an option, but just to be cautious with that option.
Yeah, there has been a study that showed that supplements, when you analyze what's inside them, actually oftentimes is not what's advertised outside of the box, and sometimes they miss a lot of the nutrients that should be in there, but in the end they aren't. Because as you said, there's a lot less control. So you're also taking a risk by taking something that is not controlled, as the medication is.
And also there some things that shouldn't be there and are in the supplements. We also need to be aware of that.
Yeah, that's really not cool. But out of curiosity, do you have an example about that?
Not a particular example, but I know that in sports, with the problem of how do we say, use of substance to improve your performance.
Yeah, the metabolic enhancers.
Yeah, we have an issue with that, because the companies that are doing those supplements do not sign for what's inside the supplement.
Yeah, so there's no quality control whatsoever, and you could be buying anything.
Yeah, we do not know.
Oh my God, this is horrifying. All right. So finally, after all of this conversation and all of this knowledge and all of this amazing thing, I have 3 remaining questions. The first one is, I think I asked it a bit in the beginning, but after this conversation, I feel it's better to have it here. How much can someone who works on their nutrition expect to get better with their ADHD?
Okay, to be real, we cannot see a major improvement in ADHD. When we compare with
pharmaceuticals.
Pharmaceuticals, obviously the first the diet cannot compare with those effects, and so, but together, like with the co-adjuvant treatment, maybe that's an interesting thing that can really help.
Okay, but on the other hand, nutrition can also worsen ADHD like way more. So it cannot improve it as much, but it can worsen it if you fuck up a lot, like you eat only processed foods and only sugar and all of that, then you can go in a very, very bad place very quickly, on the other hand,
obviously,
right?
Yeah. And we know that that diet is associated with more symptoms, with more severity of symptoms, and but just not a specific nutrient cannot be associated with specific symptoms.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the summary of this is that if you have very, very bad nutrition, it probably will worsen your ADHD, but if you have very, very good one, it will not cure you.
Obviously,
exactly.
The word cure cannot exist in this association.
But I need to say it explicitly because a lot of people, there's a lot of social media misinformation. A lot of people believe that by changing your nutrition, you can cure completely your ADHD, which obviously is not the case. Something that I've that I'm saying a lot is that usually genetics, they determine whether you have ADHD or not, and then the environment, which includes nutrition and exercise, they determine how much your ADHD impacts your life.
Obviously, this is, and I think it's the wonderful thing about ADHD. We have so many different aspects. We have so many different factors that can impact ADHD, and so nutrition is only a small part of it.
Yep. And so it cannot be a miracle thing, just like all things.
Yeah.
Then the second question is, what advice would you give to someone with ADHD trying to get better through nutrition? What is, something that is, let's say, easy to do, and some easy interventions that can be done and can be accessible?
Well, obviously, if you do not have a nutritionist in your team, maybe visit a nutritionist and with experience in ADHD people, and to explain to her what are your main issues, what are your main concerns, and to individually assess how can we better those issues, and how can we try to improve your better health and consequently your ADHD.
All right. So the easiest advice would be, to go seek help to someone who can tailor a diet specifically to you. So have blood tests and all of that.
Exactly. In nutrition, it's really difficult to say one thing that can help all people, and there's so many different issues with ADHD. There's so many
what helps one person might not help another person.
Exactly. And so my advice is to seek a specialized
tailored help.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. And finally, I think that was it, actually. I think I just had the two questions. Oh yeah, no, actually I had a third question. Okay. What is the advice that you would give to someone with ADHD and is trying to get better with eating disorders and with binge eating, with those kind of addictive behaviors, and with this kind of emotional dysregulation? What can be done there?
But first, to visit a psychologist and a nutritionist that work together, and because eating disorders have so much more that's only what we see. There's so much more behind it, and so a psychologist can really help you, and then we can solve some nutritional problems, but first to address those issues.
Exactly. So for people that have issues with food and with eating disorders, it would be solving the eating disorders first, and then have a food intervention, because otherwise having the food intervention with an eating disorders might just aggravate. It might just aggravate the eating disorder, will not work, you will backfire, and so on. So it's as you said, very important to solve the eating disorder first.
Exactly.
All right. Well, excellent. Thank you so much, for being here and for answering all these questions. I've been a pain in the neck. I know this because I ask, harsh questions. But it's been really an amazing thing. I've learned a lot personally, and I'm sure that a lot of people listening to this will learn a lot as well. So would you like to be, if there are people that have further questions, would you like to be contacted? If so, where can they contact you or your team?
Yeah, sure. Myself and my team are open to all your questions, and we can answer them. And I can give you my email. And you can share
I will write it down in the description of the podcast and of the video on YouTube, so you can email Sofia Pinto there, and her team at the University of Porto for ADHD nutrition. Do you plan on doing experiments with adults as well, or online surveys, or these kind of things as well? Because maybe that could be interesting.
Yeah,
if there are some people listening. Right?
Yeah, it's a possibility. We are currently working on children, but we are open to other opportunities, and if we can help ADHD, also adults, there are not a lot of studies in adults, and so it's a possibility. And if there's someone who would like to work with us, just get in touch.
All right. Amazing. I will put that in the email to get in touch with you and your team. And thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
Thanks.
Thank you.